The River Parish region is defined by its agricultural history and easy transportation access to New Orleans, provided by the Mississippi River. Farmers from Germany were brought here to cultivate crops for the growth of the Crescent City, while wealthy landowners created plantations for large-scale production of commodity crops. Those two worlds collided here on the West Bank in North St. John the Baptist Parish, just a mile from the St. James line. Today, we are here at Whitney Plantation, and you will meet some of the people who have created a living memorial to enslaved people and a narrative that goes beyond this property line to give us the whole story of life in the Sugar Belt during the formative years of Louisiana.
So Whitney is different. I've recently started describing Whitney as a slavery museum because that our focus, our priority is the education of slavery and presenting the perspective, interpreting what the life and experience and labor of an enslaved person would be. And they are core to our tour and our education.
Before we begin our tour of Whitney, it's best to understand the different periods of the slave trade in the United States. The first is the TransAtlantic trade period, which began in the early 1700s.
These are Africans being captured and forced through the Middle Passage over the Atlantic to what is now the United States. And transatlantic, there's estimated 12 to 13 million people that are forcibly brought over. Initially, the United States gets only 5%. Most are being brought through South America, through Caribbean, sugar-producing countries.
Historically, here in the 18th century, when this plantation was established, it was rice and indigo, and transitioned to sugarcane around 1800. 1795 is when Etienne du Bois' plantation enslaved laborers first granulated sugar there. And once that is established in Louisiana, it starts spreading out to all these other plantations because the money that they can make off of sugar is huge, right? But it also requires a lot of capital investment. So these are really wealthy plantation owners. They have to put a lot of money into the production of that sugar cane. And it requires, and this is really important for the history of sugar here, it requires technical expertise on the part of the enslaved laborers. So we're not just talking about strictly agricultural labor, people going out and picking something, right? There's a multi-step process from picking to grinding to boiling.
This house was built in 1791 by enslaved labor and has survived countless hurricanes for over 225 years. One would assume that the needed skills to build a house were taught here on site, but that is not the case.
Depending on what you want to do on your land, people also to get skilled people like cattle raisers, rice growers, blacksmith, and other specialties, you know, and people with other specialization. So we have to think about skills if you want to understand why Africans.
So the journey through the Middle Passage takes approximately 3 months. And the enslaved captives are brought over in ships that have been retrofitted for human cargo. Very cramped quarters kept below deck. Every so often, everyone is brought above board to dance, to exercise, to prevent their muscles from atrophy. Women are sometimes brought above board naked and forced to dance, and that is for the pleasure and advantage of the men that are on the ship. So even on these ships, there are acts of resistance. So there are attempted mutinies. One of my favorite stories, which was a successful mutiny, is of a ship that was headed down to New Orleans, and there was a mutiny above board, a mutiny on board, and the enslaved people took this ship and sailed it to the Bahamas.
As Louisiana was becoming a state in the early 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed. This began a slave trade from other parts of the United States.
People are coming from what's called the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and trafficked down south, principally to New Orleans. So during the time of the international trade, Charleston is really the most significant port for enslaved people, captives who were brought here. But during the time of the domestic slave trade, New Orleans was the largest slave market in the United States. So this really changes the dynamic of what's happening on these plantations. First of all, much more large-scale labor is happening in the 19th century. And you have all of these influxes of people who are coming from the Upper South with different cultures, different religions, different languages spoken, right? And here at Whitney Plantation, we can see the kind of demographic patterns of what happens on this plantation, which is that, by 1860, where we have an inventory of 101 people who were held in slavery in this plantation, almost every single adult male was born in the Upper South, whereas almost every single adult female was born here and her kids were born here. And so there's this pattern that you can understand of these young men. Young women were taken too, but this is really a traffic in young laborers, right? Young men taken down to Louisiana, to New Orleans, and then sold out to the various plantations. Sugar was different from cotton. This is a sugar plantation. Sugar really relied on male labor in a way that cotton didn't as much. There are a lot of women working in the cotton fields, but less so in the sugar parishes. And so there's really that emphasis on getting young men to work here. Now that's really critical too, because the life expectancy on these plantations is not very high. Louisiana sugar parishes are the only district in the slaveholding South that had a negative birth rate. There are more people dying on Louisiana sugar plantations than being born.
Life on a plantation was different for each person depending on your age and specific job function.
So many skills that Louisiana as a colony is lacking and will need in order to develop into a competition with other more developed nations. And so there is strategy in selecting the people that are captured and brought over. And this idea that the enslaved people were brought here and were given the skills and job training, that's not the case. It was actually the reverse in most of those cases. They had the agricultural skills.
Yeah, the schedule of enslaved people is quite simple. It is from Kensi to Kensi. From Kensi to Kensi, from Kensi to Kensi, from sunup to sundown. They wake you up early in the morning and they take you to the fields. They were under the control of slave drivers. Those were enslaved people too. But the master gave them the power to control the others. It was a system of divide and control.
Perhaps the most dangerous and stressful job was inside the house, serving as a domestic.
You have better clothes, better food, but you are not free. You are, like you said, you are always under the control of someone over there. And when you are a female, a woman working in there, you are exposed to abuse too.
Usually what happens is a woman that's in the house as a domestic, when she has children, then usually they will kind of carry on as being trained as a domestic, because quite early on they're literally with the mother. You may have domestic, women that are literally having the children of the men in the house, so there may be a need or a desire to keep the children closer, as some sort of, family unit, with the man of the house. So we see that in cases. But I think it's also erroneous for people to believe, although we see this in a lot of cases, that because you are of a lighter skin tone, that you will be in the house, versus if you are a darker complexion, you will be in the field. That is not the case.
People who work as maids, cooks, personal attendants, and their whole, day looks very, very different. They live closer to the plantation owner's house. They don't necessarily have as much separation. They kind of have to be constantly on call and ready to do whatever is required of them. A lot of times that's caring for the plantation owner's children too, right? So there's a variety of different things that would have been kept enslaved people engaged. But another thing to think about too that's important is that enslaved people carved out spaces for themselves too. These plantations were one right after another. I mean, this was really a very dense district. And the way that Louisiana plantations work, it's sort of different from other places. You have these long, skinny lots that go from the river back to the swamp. And all of the plantations hug the river, which kind of snakes around. But what happens is you have these plantations that are facing the river, and then when their properties go all the way back, because of the way the river bends, you may end up with a situation where the slave quarters on two adjoining plantations are actually really close together, much closer than where the plantation owners' homes are. And so there's communication in those what were called neighborhoods, between people. They're going back and forth. They're not supposed to, but they're going back and forth, and they're having church services, dances. We know from multiple interviews that enslaved people had dances inside the sugar mills. It's distant from the owner's house, they can't hear what's going on. So they did carve out these spaces to have their own expressions of culture as well.
When you strip someone of their name and attempt to transform their identity from free to a piece of property, what do you do about their cultural and religious beliefs?
If you baptize someone that's pagan or a heathen, then you're giving them the gift of everlasting life. And you can feel like, okay, well, it balances out. I will enslave you now, but at the end of the day, I'm giving you eternal life. So we'll work it out. So there's a lot of religious and spiritual negotiations that go on. And I'm really simplifying it. There's a lot of complexity that goes to it. Even when it comes to literacy, sometimes there is an encouragement of enslaved people being taught to read so that they could read the Bible. And then the Bible that they're given can be the Negro Bible, which eliminates all the passages that talk about, master and the slave being equal, and caring for your fellow brother, and you're given the Bible that establishes the hierarchy, the dominance of the master over the slave.
So what Joy's referring to is the Code Noir under the French control that enslaved people were baptized. Different colonial authorities had different ideas about the religion of enslaved people, whether it was more beneficial for them to have it or not have it. Enslaved people who came directly from West Africa, certainly, some of them were exposed to Catholicism on the continent of Africa, especially if they're from Central Africa, where there have been long-standing, Catholic influence there since the 1500s. So there may have been some people who are already familiar with Catholicism. Certainly from the region where a lot of enslaved people came to Louisiana, Islam was incredibly influential and important there. And we know that there were people who were enslaved on this plantation who were Muslim. And that was not uncommon at all. People who did not have, one of those types of religions, a lot of people who had, who expressed their own kind of the cosmologies and religions that are indigenous to the area that they came from. And so, one of the things to think about with this religious expression is that you end up with what's called syncretism, right? Where you kind of blend different traditions and kind of fold different beliefs into one another.
This is the heart and soul of the Whitney experience. It's called the Wall of Honor, and it tells the story of countless people who were enslaved on this property.
Everyone who we have record of who was enslaved at Whitney Plantation, formerly Habitation, Hydel.
And I think it was really important to pick those names from those registers and have them exposed, It's just like bringing them to life so that people can remember, that somebody was here, Ville Gabriel was here. That wall is just like a cemetery. They were just buried in holes in the wilderness. You cannot find them. Maybe one day randomly they will excavate some bones over there, but no identified, unmarked graves. So this museum is just like a big cemetery, You have also all the memorials where you go over there, it's just, you find names, And I think it was really worth doing it.
The Alleluia statue was created to represent freeing the bonds of slavery. The artist, Ken Smith, designed it because as he was reviewing the WPA narratives, and when enslaved people were asked, what did they think when they heard that they were freed? The word that he saw that came up most often was Alleluia. The other round circular disc represents the Middle Passage, is also by Ken Smith. And so it represents the various men and women as they're being transported and being sucked into, this vacuum of slavery. So it represents them, their forced transformation of free into now this new life of slavery. And both of those sculptures were slated for a slavery museum that never opened up in Philadelphia. Field of Angels is represented by a statue that was created to represent the children in St. John the Baptist Parish, 2,200 of them that died during enslavement, and the angel is literally holding a little baby. The infant mortality rate among the general population is high, but especially for enslaved children and enslaved babies, it's going to be indicative of the conditions that the mother is in, the amount of labor, that she is having to engage in pretty late on into her pregnancy, and the expectations of productivity, even though she is quite extensively into their pregnancy, the demands on their productivity is still pretty much there. And so we see that reflected in babies being malnourished, also women having to wean their babies earlier than what is generally recommended.
As you know, the institution of slavery was about power and control. When slaves rebelled or escaped, many were beheaded and set on poles as a fear tactic to prevent future uprisings.
In 1811, January 1811, the largest slave revolt ever happened here on the German coast. People decided to build a free nation, go into uprising just like the people of Haiti did. They did not succeed, but they tried. And who was the leader of the revolt? He was a slave driver, born just across the river here in what is today La Place.
His name is Charles Delans, was known for being a particularly brutal overseer to his fellow black men and women, enslaved people. So a three or 4 day battle, and many of them were shot and executed on the spot. The others are rounded up and tried at plantations on the East Banks, and they were executed and heads were cut off, placed on pikes along the levee. Usually people were placed, their remains were placed in front of the plantations from which they were enslaved to let everyone know that this is what happens if you try to fight for your freedom.
Keyword here is freedom. You are not free,
One of the most moving experiences on the property is the statues of the children of Whitney, created by artist Woodrow Nash.
They are our favorites. They're very, very beautiful statues, very moving. They're very lifelike, and that just goes to the talent of Woodrow Nash. He evokes and invokes a lot of spirituality, when he's creating these statues, and he treats them in the manner and philosophy of an African philosophy of these statues being vessels. And so I think that attributes a lot to the amount of presence that they evoke.
Whitney is not the original name of this plantation. For the first 106 years, the property had a different name, and it came about from the German immigrants we spoke about earlier in the program.
Whitney Plantation was originally Habitation Heidel.
The plantation was established in 1752 by Ambrose Heidel, so he was the first person who bought the property and established it as an indigo plantation.
Louisiana as a colony is failing. There's a lot of strategy choices that they made that didn't really pan out. And so the Germans come in and are key to this colony being able to survive. So they make subsistence farms and are able to supply food to the people in New Orleans. One of the resources that the German immigrants are given is access to labor.
His son took over the plantation, and they converted it to sugar around 1800, thereabouts. And that's also right around the same time that they built what's still standing, the big house, which was built sometime between 1790 and 1800. He operated the plantation, his name was Jean-Jacques Heidel. He operated the plantation until 1820, and then his sons, Jean-Jacques Heidel Jr. and Marcelin Heidel, took over the plantation. The two of them operated it in a partnership for 20 years. And then 1839 actually is when Marcelin Heidel died. He had asked for a partition of the property, separating out who owns what, because they were trying to dissolve their operations. His widow, Marie Azalie Heidel, inherits his 1/3 ownership of the plantation at his death, and then buys out her brother-in-law, Jean-Jacques Heidel, for the rest of the 2/3. So she becomes the sole owner of the plantation in 1840, and she's the sole owner of the plantation from 1840 to 1860 when she dies. So we really focus in on her ownership because she owned it during kind of the biggest, most profitable years, and she was the last sole owner in that family.
The Civil War and Emancipation changed plantation life, but not as much as one would think.
When Marie Azalie Heidel died in 1860, they had here 101 enslaved people. Like 40 of the 101 people who were on the inventory of 1860, they stayed with the former masters. So you don't have no place to go, you just stay. And you become a sharecropper, or some were sharecroppers, others had, wages. And after a time, you don't even get paid. They just gave you tokens, and you can only use it with the boutique right here on the plantation.
So the workers on plantations end up in debt to their own employers just for the basic necessities of life. So there are people here, and the same thing is true with the doctors that would come to visit. So there were people here in the 1940s and 1950s on this plantation who were in deep debt to the plantation owner or to the doctor. With the wages that they were being paid, there was no way they could ever get out of it.
It's hard to believe, but people lived and worked at Whitney up until 1975.
There were still resident cane workers living in former slave cabins that had, been homes for enslaved people many decades before. Other plantations shut down later. I mean, there were plantations that were still operating in Louisiana in the 1980s, right? I mean, this history is really not as far back. Now, they're doing a very different job. And that's one thing that's very, important to remember too, that, the type of work and the type of life that people lived here in 1975 was just really not the same, right? Principally, really maybe is the influence of technology. That really changes the nature of work on a plantation.
Although this church was built elsewhere and later moved on the property, it has a unique history.
I think it's an excellent symbol of the resilience and the cohesion and the strategy of the formerly enslaved people. It was built after Emancipation, 1870, and it was built across the river in Paulina. And its origins are in a benevolent society, and we see a lot of these are created. And then when there's a need for resources, especially when it comes to burying loved ones. So a lot of times you'll see these benevolent societies, and burial associations. As the society was originally known as the Antioch Benevolent Society, the name eventually changed to Antioch. And as those funds were amassed, they were able to purchase land and built this church. And so it involved separating the church into 3 pieces and bringing over each piece, one of which got stuck on the bridge, but eventually all the parts were reunited on site and then renovated to what you see now.
John Cummings bought Whitney Plantation in the late 90s. He said that he had visions of moonlight and magnolias in an antebellum fantasy. After doing his research, he decided that the truth must be told, and the Slavery Museum concept was born.
He acquires the research that was done by Formosa, and through his research, and especially looking at the enslaved people, and as a lawyer, like seeing the legal ramifications of it, he decides that this should be a place that is centered on teaching people about slavery, because he felt that he he was in his, I think, 60s or 70s when he purchased this place, and he realized that there was just so much about slavery that he didn't know, and so that's when he decided to dedicate this the mission to telling the story of slavery.
He worked on the restoration for 15 years and opened it to the public in 2014. And so we've been open. He donated the property in 2019, so he's no longer involved, but he founded the museum.
Here in Louisiana, people struggle with the story of slavery and its lasting effects. We know it's a black eye in our past, but often it remains the elephant in the room that we avoid talking about. In order for us to create a better future, we must go back and understand our past.
To allow people to learn about slavery the way it was, without any sugarcoating, or what it involved. Our people were traded, worked to death, and all the abuse, especially for the ladies and women. Children were abused, denied education.
We really don't know anything about the management of the Heidel family who owned the plantation during slavery. We understand what slavery was like in Louisiana and assume that the Heidel family was about like every other family, which is to say that most enslaved people in the South experienced brutal labor, familial separation, physical violence, right? These were common practice on plantations, and there's no reason to think that they weren't in place here.
So when you leave Whitney and you've taken the tour here, what I most want you to feel is the need to learn more. Need to learn more, the need to see American history in a way that is normally not presented, to see the influence of the enslaved Africans, but also to see the influence of other rich cultures that have contributed to Louisiana and to the United States. So.
We made this program with the intent of encouraging you to visit Whitney Plantation. If you are in our viewing area, this is a perfect day trip for you and your family. Whitney is located on the River Road in Wallace, Louisiana. It's just south of the Lutcher-Gramercy Bridge on the west side of the Mississippi River. Visit the website at whitneyplantation.org for more information and self-guided tour times. I'm Megan Archer, and thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to bring you more Louisiana local programming like this in the near future. So long.